She was 13 years old when they married her off. No one asked her opinion. Nobody really cared. She was a Howard, and the Howards didn't marry for love. They married for power, for alliances, for land. That was just how the world worked in 1606, and Frances had known it her whole life. You were a girl. You were a pawn. You smiled, you obeyed, and you did what you were told. Except Frances didn't. What came next would shake the entire English court. A loveless marriage she refused to accept, a passion so reckless it bordered on obsession. And at the heart of it all, a man who ended up dead in the Tower of London, his body so ravaged that when the doctors examined him, they didn't know what to say. Some things, it seemed, were better left unasked. This is not a simple story about a villain, and it's not a simple story about a victim either, though she was, in many ways, both. Even as the court gossiped and ballad sellers hawked lurid prints of the wicked countess, a preacher in London cautioned, "Let he who casts stones recall how desire may ruin even the righteous." The whispers were never unanimous. Some saw Frances as dangerously ambitious. Others pitied a girl given away in marriage before she could read a psalm. From the beginning, the lines were never clear. This is a story about what happens when a woman with intelligence, ambition, and absolutely no legal power decides she is done playing by the rules, and what it costs her when the world finds out. Now, before we go any further, I need you to pause with me for just a second. If you were in her place, 13, alone, trapped, what would you have done? Think about it. There's something about this story that most people miss entirely. When Frances Howard stood trial in 1616, she pleaded guilty. She confessed. And in the version of history that most people know, that's the end of it. She did it, she confessed, case closed. Villain confirmed. But here's what nobody tells you. The man she was accused of killing, the man at the center of this entire scandal, had spent months writing letters from his prison cell. Letters that were filled with secrets. Secrets about the king, about the king's closest companions, about things that, if made public, could have brought down the most powerful people in England. And somehow, conveniently, those letters disappeared. Almost all of them. Gone. The investigation into his death was delayed for 2 years. Here's what that looks like. September 1613. Overbury dies. The first rumours begin to swirl, but no action is taken. His letters, so dangerous to the crown, are quietly removed from the Tower's files, no trace left for prosecutors or the public. Months pass. By early 1614, crucial witnesses change positions, travel, or simply vanish. In mid-1614, those in charge of the king's innermost circle, including his chief minister and the Howards themselves, sign off on extending the inquiry again. Each delay gives more time for evidence to evaporate and the narrative to be managed. The people who orchestrated these delays and benefited from silence were the very ones the vanished letters would have implicated. The story's shape was never an accident. It was drawn by those with everything to lose. So yes, Frances Howard may well have been guilty, but the question of who was really pulling the strings in this story and who needed her to take the fall is far darker and far more complicated than a simple tale of a jealous wife. Stay with me. You can almost feel the air shifting, the room tightening, shadows flickering against the panelled walls, every candle suddenly guttering as if something unspoken has just swept through. This is the moment when pulses quicken and secrets edge closer to the surface. Because this is where it gets interesting. To understand Frances Howard, you have to understand the world that made her. She was born around 1590 into the Howard family, one of the oldest and most powerful noble families in England. Her father was Thomas Howard, the Earl of Suffolk. Her great-uncle was the Duke of Norfolk. This was a family that had survived the chaos of the Tudor court, the executions, the religious upheavals, the constant political knife fights of Henry VIII's reign. They survived because they were strategic. Cold-blooded, some would say. Frances grew up at court. She was educated, she was beautiful, and from a very young age, she understood that her value, her literal market value, was her looks and her family name. That was it. That was the entirety of what the world thought she had to offer. Girls like Frances didn't choose their husbands, their families chose for them, and the girls smiled and accepted it, because what else was she going to do? In 1606, when Frances was around 13, she married Robert Devereux, the young Earl of Essex. He was 14. Neither of them wanted this. It was a political arrangement between two powerful families, pure and simple, and almost immediately after the ceremony, the two were separated. Essex was packed off to continue his education, and Frances was left behind at court. They barely knew each other. They were, in every meaningful sense, strangers. The court of King James I was a strange and fascinating place. James himself was an awkward, scholarly, anxious man, not particularly interested in the grand ceremonies of kingship. What he was interested in was his favourites. James had a well-documented habit of becoming intensely, passionately attached to handsome young men at court, showering them with titles, money, and influence that enraged the established nobility. One of those favourites was a young Scottish man named Robert Carr. He had arrived at court around 1607, charming and ambitious, and James had become almost immediately besotted with him. Carr rose with astonishing speed, given lands, titles, and access to the king that most men spent lifetimes trying to achieve. By the time Francis Howard really noticed him, he was one of the most powerful men in England, and he was extraordinarily good-looking. Francis fell hard. There's no other way to put it. By around 1610, she and Carr were deeply entangled, writing letters, meeting in secret, and conducting what was, by any standard of the time, a wildly reckless affair. She was a married woman. He was the king's favourite. The combination should have made both of them more cautious. Instead, it seemed to make them bolder. Carr, for his part, was being advised by his close friend Sir Thomas Overbury, a sharp, ambitious man who had helped Carr navigate his rise to power. Overbury was not happy about Francis's situation, not even slightly. He knew the Howards. He knew their reputation for playing long games and using people, and he said so, loudly. He told Carr that Francis was beneath him, that the match would ruin his reputation, and that a Howard woman would bring nothing but trouble. Francis, for her part, despised Overbury, and Overbury knew it. When Essex finally returned from his travels, the marriage was, to put it kindly, not a success. Frances had no interest in her husband and made no attempt to hide it. Essex, for whatever reason, seemed unable to make the marriage work in the most basic sense. Whether this was physical, emotional, or simply the result of two people who were strangers to each other and deeply miserable, history doesn't entirely agree on. What Frances decided to do about it was breathtaking in its audacity. She applied for an annulment. Now, annulments were not unheard of in early 17th century England, but they were rare, difficult, and required extraordinary circumstances. The grounds Frances put forward were remarkable. She claimed that Essex was impotent, but crucially, impotent only with her. The implication was that this was the result of witchcraft, that someone had cast a spell specifically to prevent their union from being consummated. Essex was outraged. This was an attack on his manhood, his reputation, his very name, and he denied everything furiously. The case went before a commission of bishops who had to determine whether the marriage had been consummated. Frances submitted to a physical examination by a panel of noblewomen, though rumours flew almost immediately that she had sent a veiled substitute in her place, someone whose virginity could be confirmed without exposing whatever Frances herself may or may not have been. In early 17th century England, accusations of impotence were not just personal. They touched the border between medicine and the supernatural. It was widely believed that impotence could be caused by witchcraft, and that a spell might render a man unable to perform only with a particular woman, while otherwise remaining virile. The church and secular authorities took such claims seriously enough to investigate, and the idea that a marriage could be cursed held real legal power. For a woman with no right to seek a divorce and few legal protections, these beliefs in magical interference offered a rare and risky loophole, a strategy to escape a binding union when all honest avenues were closed. The commission was divided. The king was not. James I, who adored Carr and wanted him happy, quietly tilted the process in Frances's favour. The annulment was granted in September 1613. The court was buzzing. Half of London thought the whole thing was a farce. The other half was simply astonished that she'd pulled it off. While all of this was unfolding, Thomas Overbury had not gone quiet. He continued to oppose the match, continued to make his feelings known, and fatally, continued to know things he shouldn't. Overbury had spent years as Carr's closest confidant. He knew the contents of letters. He knew the shape of private conversations between Carr and the king. He was, to put it plainly, dangerous. In April 1613, Overbury was offered a diplomatic post abroad as ambassador to Russia, or possibly to the Netherlands, depending on which account you follow. Refusing the king's appointment was an act of serious disrespect. Overbury refused it anyway. He may have been manipulated into refusing. There are suggestions that he was advised by people who knew the refusal would give the authorities an excuse to act. Whatever the reason, the refusal landed him in the Tower of London. And once he was inside, he didn't come out alive. Overbury died in September 1613, the same month Frances received her annulment. The official cause of death was listed as illness. He had been sick for some time, that much was true, but the nature of that illness was something people would argue about for years. Those who saw him near the end described a man who had deteriorated shockingly quickly, vomiting, terrible sores, and a body that seemed to be falling apart from the inside. At the time, it was accepted. People died in the tower all the time. The conditions were grim. Illness was expected. For now. In December 1613, Frances Howard and Robert Carr were married. It was one of the grandest events of the Jacobean court. The king paid for much of it himself, a lavish display of royal approval. Carr was created Earl of Somerset. Frances became the Countess of Somerset. They were, by any visible measure, at the absolute peak of English society. But time has a way of turning on people who have done things in the dark. By 1615, Robert Carr's star was falling. A new favourite had appeared at court, George Villiers, young, devastatingly charming, and clearly capturing the king's attention in a way that Carr no longer could. Carr's enemies, who had been waiting patiently, smelled blood. And somewhere in that shifting political landscape, someone decided it was time to ask questions about how Thomas Overbury had really died. The investigation that followed was one of the most sensational legal proceedings England had seen in a generation. Servants were arrested, apothecaries were questioned, a woman known as Anne Turner, who had helped Frances source various substances, medicines, potions, and things of questionable purpose, was taken in for questioning. Under pressure, the stories began to spill out. Overbury had been poisoned. Systematically, over a period of months. Arsenic, mercury, and other substances had been introduced into his food and medicine, a slow, agonizing process designed to look like illness. Multiple people had been involved in acquiring and administering the poison. The trail led, step by step, back to Francis. Anne Turner was tried and hanged. Several others followed. Then, in May 1616, Frances Howard herself stood before the Lord High Steward and the assembled peers of England. The gallery was packed. People had been jostling for places since before dawn. Frances pleaded guilty. She did not fight it. She stood there, reportedly in a state of visible distress, and admitted to her role in the murder of Thomas Overbury. What exactly she confessed to, and how much she actually admitted versus what was assumed, has been argued over by historians ever since. But the plea was entered. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. Carr, who was tried separately, pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence throughout. Many at court found this cowardly. His wife had confessed, and here he was insisting he knew nothing. The jury didn't believe him. He was found guilty too. And then James I stepped in. He couldn't do it. He couldn't execute his former favourite. Perhaps there was genuine affection. Perhaps there was fear of what Carr might say if he had nothing left to lose. Perhaps both. Whatever the reason, both Francis and Carr had their death sentences commuted. They were imprisoned in the Tower in separate quarters because by this point their marriage had collapsed entirely, each apparently blaming the other and then, after a few years, quietly released. They were exiled from the court, required to live in the country, away from London, away from power, away from everything that had defined their lives. They had been granted their lives. Whether that was mercy or its own kind of punishment is a matter of perspective. Frances Howard died in 1632. She was around 41 years old. She spent her last years largely forgotten, living in the countryside with a husband she had come to hate, far from the glittering world she had burned everything to reach. History has not been kind to her. For centuries, she was held up as a cautionary tale, the dangerous, beautiful woman who used poison and manipulation to destroy a good man. She became almost a figure of legend, a Jacobean Lady Macbeth, the embodiment of female ambition run murderously wrong. But sit with it for a moment. Sit with the actual shape of her life. She was married at 13 to a stranger. She had no say in it. She was sent to live at a court where her looks were currency and her opinions were irrelevant. Frances's story was not unique. Across England's noble families, girls were bartered for land, titles, or political influence, often as young as 12 or 13, with little thought for their wishes or happiness. Their names fill the marriage contracts and family records, rarely their own letters or voices trapped in lives chosen for them by fathers and uncles looking to secure their place at court. When Frances fell in love with someone and tried to free herself from a marriage she never chose, she had exactly one avenue available to her: a humiliating public examination and a legal process wholly dependent on royal approval. She had no rights to her own body, no right to choose her partner, and no ability to end a marriage on her own terms. Her desperation was not a private failing, but the predictable outcome of a system that treated women as commodities and leverage, generation after generation. None of that excuses what she did. A man died. Whatever Thomas Overbury's faults, he did not deserve to be slowly poisoned in a prison cell. That is the part that doesn't bend, no matter how sympathetically you read the rest of the story. But the reason the story of Frances Howard still matters 400 years later is not really about poison, scandal, or a court trial. It's about what happens when a society gives a group of people, in this case women, essentially no legitimate means of controlling their own lives. You get illegitimate ones. You get desperation dressed up as scheming. You get people making terrible choices inside a world that offered them no good ones. If that sounds distant, it's worth pausing for a moment. Around the world today, there are still girls forced into marriages they never chose, people navigating rules written to keep them powerless, and entire communities making impossible decisions when the law offers no way out. The centuries and costumes may change, but the machinery of constrained agency persists. Frances Howard's story is not just history. It is the shadow of systems still at work in workplaces, courts, and even families. The names change, but the questions remain. Frances Howard was many things: clever, reckless, passionate, ruthless. She was also a product of a world that treated her as property from the day she was born. The story of what she did with that is ugly, but it is never, ever simple. And that, more than the poison or the trial or the scandal, is why we're still talking about her. If you want more stories like this, the ones history buries, the ones that don't fit neatly into a hero or villain box, subscribe. There are more of them, far more than you'd think.